Yes, thanks, Shane, and it's great to be here and great to finally be underway with Cold Chain Live after all the disruptions. And thanks as well to our first two speakers who've really set the scene well for me to come in and talk about how the Cold Chain Federation is going to step up around net zero and support our members further as we move forward towards the long road towards 2050. Before I do that, I just wanted to take a quick step back. Those of you who've kind of been with us on our journey since we became the Cold Chain Federation back in June 2019 will hopefully have seen that we've stepped up and we have shown leadership so far to this challenge that we see as one of our biggest policy areas around energy, climate change, and also net zero. We've produced new guidance. Hopefully, most of you will have seen our energy and efficiency in cold stores guide. If you haven't, it's available to download on our website, and it's also down, if you look down in the handouts tab of GoToWebinar, you'll see you can download a PDF there. The main aim of that document was to support climate change agreement for cold stores, which is our main kind of sort of policy that we undertake on behalf of government. We administer, and we've heard about the successes we've seen in that area, and also getting that extended this year through to 2025, currently open to new entrants. And we've also already started the conversation around energy and climate change through our Energy Summit back in June, which many of you have attended and was really well attended, and also our Cold Chain Connect webinar sessions. And of course today as well, so which sees the kind of, well, this whole week and month sees the launch of the next step, which is our pledge and our ambition towards net zero. And what we're doing this week is launching our net zero project, which is, as you can see on screen, a long-term commitment. And by long-term commitment, we mean it doesn't necessarily have an end date, or perhaps it's 2050, but maybe beyond, to support our industry and our members to navigate the pathway through to a zero economy by 2050, and supporting the UK government and society to do that. And that's really in answer to feedback we've had from our members about how that's a core issue for us, and because of the anticipated rapid change we see in this area in terms of regulation, and we're already seeing kind of potential restrictions on use of equipment, economic potential taxes coming in, perhaps carbon taxes and things like that, but also social pressures as well from customers and suppliers, as we heard from in Tim Moran's interview that we released on Wednesday. There's a growing need for businesses to be seen to be reducing their emissions and doing their bit, but also from citizens, from society itself. And so this really is the launch of our long-term commitment to support members further. And how we're going to do that is what I'm going to go on to describe now. And the first part of that is part one, which is our Road to Net Zero. Part one, setting the scene document, which hopefully you've all been bombarded with links to on social media and email. But if you haven't downloaded that yet, don't worry, it's also in the handout tab, so you can download a PDF for that and look at that now. But the purpose of this document is really to set out our ambition for our net zero project and outline what we hope to achieve, and the key questions and challenges that we think that we need to answer as an industry. And just for the next few minutes, what I'm going to do is just run through the key parts of this document. So it's split into 4 main sections, which are going to compromise our 4 main work strands as we move forward with our net zero project. Just before I get onto those 4, I think it's really key to emphasize the point that this is not just about flagging that the cold chain and refrigeration is a high energy, high emitting industry. It's about also pressing the benefits of the cold chain, which is huge in terms of preventing food waste, post-harvest food losses. And that's always got to be at the forefront of our mind when we're talking about reducing emissions, is also making sure that we're balancing that by talking about the positives and the purpose of the cold chain, which is keeping food safe, but also minimizing food waste, which is a huge issue in society today. So those of you who've looked in the document will recognize this diagram. And this is the first part of our net zero project, which is defining the cold chain, which is obviously the focus of this week. What this document, this image aims to do is set out what the cold chain looks like. And we've picked here, we could have picked anything, but for the purposes of the diagram, we've picked the journey of New Zealand lamb from farm through to the consumer. And the purpose here isn't to show that that's a long way, and that's going to be producing lots of emissions. We know in many cases actually food grown closer to home can actually have a greater carbon emission than that imported, due to our intensive agricultural production of that food. So it doesn't necessarily mean, that's kind of why we don't hear the term food miles used very much anymore, because it's not the best way necessarily to measure the carbon emissions of a particular product. But what we chose this example for was because it was really good at showing the complex chain and how many different strands there are in a cold chain, both internationally and also domestically when it enters the UK border. So the first part of our challenge is really to define what we mean by net zero cold chain. What does it look like, and what's the most we can achieve? We know that refrigeration will always require energy, so we can't achieve an emission-free cold chain. But what does good look like, and what offsetting and what mitigation that we've heard from the other speakers will we have to kind of impose to get to 2050? But we can't do that in silos, and I think that's what this diagram is trying to get across, is that us as a cold chain federation, we're going to be focusing, as I'll come on to in a moment, cold chain processes. But the cold chain is linked to so many different sectors that we can't do this on our own. We're going to need to partner and work with other sectors when we look across cold chains, whether it's agriculture, haulage, shipping, you can see them all across the bottom there, retailing. We're linked to a huge number of different sectors. But the big questions are kind of what is our, as a cold chain business in the UK, what is our responsibility, and where does that end? Is it just when a product passes through our cold store or our vehicle, or do we have a responsibility to look kind of wider across the UK or perhaps even internationally? I mean, we import just over 50% of our food in the UK, but actually the emissions for our total food, our relative emissions are more like 60%. So what is our duty around those kind of wider emissions? So this, I think, is probably the most difficult part of the challenge, is actually defining what we mean and what our responsibilities are, as well as looking at the current trajectory and what changes we'll need to make to meet that 2050 ambition. So the next two sections I'm not going to spend much time on, because I think we've covered these quite well with Alan and Rob. But when we look at those cold chain processes, we're primarily talking about storage and distribution, so cold stores and obviously temperature controlled vehicles. And there's a lot to go through when it comes to improving energy management in cold stores, which we've heard about in terms of improving those, and also in how we use energy. And the big question here is what does good look like? So what does 2050 look like? But what are those incremental sort of changes we'll need to see between now and then? And we've already seen some of them starting to happen around renewable energy and other things, and we'll hear about automation, I think, in the next session. But we're really looking at those core challenges around improving our buildings, and we need to be doing that now, because we know cold stores being planned and built now will be expected to last many decades. So those decisions made now are critical. This isn't something we can wait and just deal with kind of in the 2040s, but also that better management of energy in terms of demand side response, energy storage, heat recycling, as we've heard from Rob. And then the next one, temperature controlled distribution, an area that the Federation has been very active with, particularly recently. And we're seeing very rapid kind of technology evolving here, as well as also government kind of regulation and changes to policy. So we see this as core, is setting out the future of temperature controlled distribution, how we can move towards hopefully an emission-free or a zero-emission cold chain distribution in the future. And that's looking at equipment, so TRUs, and we can transition away from diesel, the refrigerants that go into them, but also trailer standards and ensuring that damaged older units come off the roads, better temperature monitoring, but also looking perhaps in the short term how we operate those. Could we train our drivers better to operate those TRUs, particularly to multi-speed units? Could we be stacking them better? Could we be delivering things better in terms of opening and shutting doors? And then the final section really recognises that we can't look at these things in individual. We can't just look at cold stores, can't look at distribution. We have to look across the supply chain as well. And there's a number of challenges here. And again, I think we've touched on these in the first two presentations. But we're looking at how we can enable change from a supply chain ecosystem wide perspective, and that's the the topic for week 4 of Cold Chain Live, in terms of better digitisation, better data visibility across the supply chain, consolidation of route planning, which Alan talked about, and just generally better cooperation between businesses. And as we've probably touched on, the drivers for those are quite varied, both from government, from society, but also internally from industry as well. So hopefully that gives a flavour of what we're trying to achieve with our net zero project. But the last thing I wanted to just mention before handing back to Shane was this is your project. This is a project for our members, for our industry, and we really want you to get involved with this and to kind of work with us on this journey next year, but beyond as well. What you'll see after Cold Chain Live is that we'll be seeking to build collaborations with stronger collaboration with our members, with suppliers, with other industry bodies from some of those industries I talked about, but also the key government departments. And you'll see plenty of opportunities for participation in our net zero roundtables, future Cold Chain Connect webinars, and in other ways as well. And the next time we'll be getting together to sort of discuss this topic will be our Cold Chain Insight event in March, which will mark 6 months to COP26 in Glasgow, which we can expect there will be some government pledges around reducing emissions going further than they have already prior to that event, but also at the end of the year as well with the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget. And that's when we'll aim to be looking at part 2 of our net zero report, which will aim to answer that first question, defining net zero and how we navigate all the challenges around that. So that's the project. But as I mentioned, we really want you to get involved. So please get in touch with me, get in touch with the Federation, and let us know your support.